All right. Thank you for everyone. Thank you to everyone who was. Thank you to all our audience members who've taken the time to join us this morning. We are going to get started right now. The topic of our discussion today is data in motion trends that are currently shaping the FSI industry. From the presentations and discussions today, you can expect to gain some insight on current data technology, data governance, and how these work together to add value to a business. But before we move forward, let me take some time to introduce everyone, to introduce all the panelist members to you. First up today, we have with us Niels Mekkedel, who is the CTO of who is CTO Global Digital Banking at Standard Chartered Bank. Good morning, Niels. Thank you for joining us today as a panelist. We also have thank you, Niels. Sorry for that. We also have with us Mark Teehan, who is Principal Solution Engineer at Confluent. Apart from that, apart from Niels and Mark, we also have with us Mohan Sanagapalli, who is Lead Cloud and DevOps Engineer at PALO IT. And finally, we have me. My name is Kevin. I'm a Lead Data Engineer at PALO IT, and I'm going to be your host and moderator for the panel discussion. Before we proceed to the presentations, I would like to inform everyone of the format that we're going to be following today. First up, we have a presentation on top 5 data in motion trends in 2021. The presenter of that presentation is going to be Mark Teehan. Post that, we'll have a panel discussion on data trends, and that will lead us to about 10 minutes at the end of Q&A. With regards to any audience questions, Greg will be sharing a link to a website called Mentimeter, where you can post your questions at any time. You can post your questions on Mentimeter at any time during the presentation or the panel discussion. And at the end, during the Q&A session, we'll be referring to Mentimeter for the list of questions to put to our panel. And that's what we'll be looking at, right at the end for the Q&A session. All right, I think I've given everyone a bit of a run through of what you can expect and what you can hope to gain out of out of joining us today. Sorry about that. So without much further ado, I'll pass the mic over to Mark for his presentation on top 5 data in motion trends.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Good morning, everyone. Let me just share my screen. Morning. It's a real pleasure to be here today. My name is Mark Teehan. I am a Principal Solution Engineer with Confluent, based here in Singapore. I've been with Confluent for about 3 years. And today's webinar is the top 5 data in motion trends that will reshape the FSI industry in 2021 and beyond. In my 20 years here in Singapore, I've had various roles in banks over the years, mostly in database and data-oriented roles, and mostly for data at rest type systems rather than data in motion. So I've picked 5 trends that I observe as I work with banks and companies in the financial services industry for Confluent. I mostly focus on banks in Thailand and in Singapore. It's interesting to see how the banks in each market operate quite differently. Thailand is very progressive on modernizing applications using sort of microservice techniques. And concerns in Singapore are largely about running larger regional businesses and integrating very large database and data store estates with a desire for data in motion. So I picked 5 trends, discussing things with my peers in Confluent, including Darren, whom you know, and also other people in similar data-oriented industries. So for the next 15 to 20 minutes or so, I'm going to go through these. It's a shame we can't do this in person. That would have been really nice. I hope you have your breakfast and your coffee. We'll be having a discussion afterwards. So if you have any questions, please note them down and feel free to ask me in the second half of today's webinar. So the first one is to offer a streaming platform capability, or perhaps to be more specific, to offer a centralized streaming platform capability. In my opinion, a streaming platform is a new data storage category. We are quite used to more traditional data storage categories. The database estates of banks are very large, and we can see in 10 years to 2021, $1.65 trillion were spent on databases and data warehouses. This is a huge market, and it's still where the lion's share of data is stored for financial services customers. Mainframes here at the bottom, are still an absolutely core and critical part of banking infrastructure. With no mainframe, there is no bank. And transaction volumes on mainframes in 2019 were up 55%. From sort of the end, from the origins of the pandemic and right through 2020, every bank that I know that I work with, their mainframes are pretty much running red hot at the huge increase in transaction volumes. Mainframes and core banking systems based on mainframes are such a critical part of every bank's operation that they're part of every story, really, when we're talking about where the data resides. And of course, big data systems, whether this is a Hadoop-based system or something that's more specific, such as Databricks, running Spark, etc. Large volumes of data are stored here as well. These are three traditional data store categories that we're all familiar with. In my opinion, data streaming is now a fourth category. There are different options available for the technology that you use for your data streaming system. Kafka is one. If you're unfamiliar with Confluent, Confluent is the company created by founded by the creators of Apache Kafka when it was created in LinkedIn around about 12 or 13 years ago. And it has now emerged as one of the most popular data streaming platforms available. By offering a centralized data streaming platform, you're really offering the ability to set data in motion from the other data storage systems that you have. So you can stream from databases through Kafka out to various applications, the same in and out of your big data system and in and out of your mainframe. And I think offering this as a central platform in the same way that your big data system is a central platform across the bank in almost all cases. It's pretty common to have a number of core banking systems running on individual mainframes, but for each large part of the business, for cards or loans or deposits, etc. And it's normal to have a very high number of databases, often tens of thousands of databases across the various vendors. But although we do see banks selecting data streaming platforms for individual applications, there's almost always a desire to have a single central platform in the bank offering a shared service capability for any applications that want to offer a streaming capability for the bank. That's my first choice. My second is to modernize core banking systems through cloud native technology. So focusing specifically on the core banking systems or the mainframe systems here, of course, technology is evolving from the vendors that provide the core banking systems themselves, from the vendor that provides you the hardware, the operating system, etc., for your core banking system. But there's a faster evolution occurring really for the cloud hyperscalers. There's a general desire across banks to apply cloud native technology in the bank to leverage the elasticity of systems that you observe if you're running systems, say, on AWS. The ability to have data everywhere. It's really about sharing data across the entire bank with as the least amount of friction as possible, and the completeness of data. The ability to join disparate data sources together to offer a more holistic view of data to downstream consumers or subscribers. Often those downstream systems are microservices, increasingly we're seeing companies adopting data in motion systems in order to send data around the bank in a streaming fashion. So trying to move away from sending data as batch once a day or twice a day or once an hour, and moving to sending data continuously through the systems. It's quite a different set of technology to the traditional batch ETL tools. Probably the greatest challenge with doing this, of course, is capturing the data from the core systems. It's all very well to say we're going to make our core banking system data available everywhere and it will be complete. And the ability to capture it can be quite challenging. There are specialist data capture tools for this. If you're running on an IBM mainframe, then using IBM CDC, for instance. If supposing you're running something like Systematics and VSAM, then IBM CDC is a very logical choice to capture that data. If your core banking systems run on databases, you have much more choices available. From specialist vendors, from the major technology providers, and from vendors such as ourselves for streaming from databases into systems. Much of the focus, much of the focus for this is driven by the desire to do application transformation, from rebuilding monolith systems to microservice systems. It's fairly rare these days to see a completely new application design based on a very traditional stack where you're designing a database schema, a physical and a logical schema, deploying that to a database, then deploying an application tier, etc. It's much more common to deploy event-driven microservices where individual services deployed on a framework such as Java or .NET or Python or whatever are able to perform discrete operations on that data, and they exchange data via some sort of an event-driven platform. Given that we count the rate of evolution of core banking systems, certainly in years, it's just completely unrealistic to consider a complete platform migrations for these types of systems in the short term. So the way to address that really is to use these best of breed technologies wherever possible to figure out how to do data capture in order to be able to provide the data that's needed to these sorts of microservices. An example I could give you, we have a customer in Thailand that actually captures their entire deposit account base every 24 hours. They capture that from their Systematics system and they feed that into a Confluent system, and then it feeds a whole bunch of downstream systems. So that's part of the batch cycle where they wait for the overnight batch to complete, updating all the deposit accounts for the bank before streaming that out and making it available to microservice systems for 24 hours when the whole process reruns. That's my second choice. My third is to handle frequently identifiable data, personally identifiable data on the client side. What I mean here by PII are the data that you're, as banks or financial institutions are obliged to protect. So such as my name as Mark Tehan will be replaced by a string or a token, such as we see here on the right. Here I'm not really talking about encryption. We have to assume that data in flight is encrypted always, within the bank and outside the bank. If you're running a system in Kubernetes, then it's encrypted inside Kubernetes as well. So it goes without saying that all data in flight should be encrypted. It's very easy to tap onto a network and see the data that's flowing by. Very occasionally I hear an argument that data systems within the bank don't require the same level of protection as data systems outside the bank, but I think quite a number of quite high profile cases globally have proved that it's actually pretty important to assume that your data in flight is always encrypted. What I'm really talking about here is replacing sensitive data with tokens. We do this at the granularity of an attribute. We don't consider changing, say, an entire record for, say, a loan or a mortgage that may contain attributes of personal data and replacing all of that. It's just the individual attributes: my name, my IC number, my phone number, my address, etc. Each of these should be replaced with a token that we see on the right. Tokens, of course, can be vaulted or vaultless. Vaulted is very straightforward. We send Mark Tehan to a system and it would return us back this string, and it stores both of them in a specialized database called a vault in order to protect that. Vaultless is really doing that algorithmically. There's no need to store either items of data. We simply run it through an algorithm that will deterministically send back the same token each time. There are a number of vendors developing vaultless tokenization technology, which is a very interesting area because it's certainly one less thing to protect. Then, of course, you have to protect the algorithm that generates your tokens. It's a different sort of infosec. And of course, the important part is detokenizing requests have to be governed by access control. This could be as simple as identifying the requestor that wants to detokenize the TWFYAY back to my name. And that could be someone that's standing in front of me in a branch. It could be somebody on a call center. It could be a relationship manager that's looking after private banking. It could be somebody on a broker trading desk that's executing a trade. But there are other factors, of course. It may depend on the country that my account is resident in, the location of the requestor, even the time of day that a request is being made. And an associated trend with this is we're seeing the use of graph databases such as Neo4j in order to store all of these complex relationships between data specifically for access control. So if you want to add more and more edges to your data around things like the time of day that the requester origin, the account holder origin, and as many edges as you want, and you can actually quite rapidly build up a graph database that contains billions of edges when you multiply all of your account holders by all of your staff, by all of your locations, by all of your time windows, etc. Tokenization must be irreversible. There's no point in doing all this if your data becomes available to someone of ill intent and they're able to detokenize the data. Of course, it must be irreversible in a similar way to encrypted data being irreversible. And the final one is considering performance concerns early. This sort of operation is quite compute intensive. So returning a token for a string does require a fair bit of churning in the same way as compression is compute intensive and encryption is compute intensive. So thinking about what are our data volumes at our peak time? So supposing month end is a peak when you may have 5x or 10x or 50x data volumes that you have for the rest of the month, you have to kind of think, well, how is my tokenization engine going to cope with a wave of data like this? And this is really depending on your data storage technology, your ability to parallelize these types of operations. I work a fair bit in this area with banks. In order to get many parallel streams of tokenization available from their streaming platform into the tokenization store. And a final point on this is I believe this should be a centralized policy, not a developer responsibility. The first system that sort of puts their hands up and says, we're going to be storing data for Indonesian customers in a database in Singapore, therefore we're obliged to tokenize all of the PII. Then the policy for this should be centralized and not set at an individual system level, because it brings in the larger picture of the access control graph, how we determine if someone's allowed to detokenize, the algorithms, of course, the technology that we're going to use, vaulted or vaultless, the ability to parallelize this and scale it out during peak times. And probably most importantly is the identification of data sensitivity and mapping that back to our source systems. So it's easy to tell in a database. It's easy to identify particular data and apply a governance policy over that and say, every time I see IC number, I know that this needs to be tokenized, et cetera, et cetera. Less so in big data systems where data doesn't always have a structure. And my advice is on data streaming systems, you should have the same standards and expectations that you have for your databases. The technology is there, and you should be able to insist and say, all data that flows through my data streaming system must be structured. It must be change controlled. It must be governed exactly the same as I would do for, say, an Oracle database. My third choice. My fourth choice is to leverage AI over your data, to create differentiated customer experiences. So in my opinion, all data streams, really, if it just goes from from an ATM to your core banking system. For that brief moment, it streams before it hits that data store. Confluent worked more and more with companies that really want their data in motion. It's about keeping that data in motion for all of the various applications that can use that data in a timely way. The difference in batch and streaming is really just a difference of perception. It's quite a big difference in perception. As someone who has a very strong sort of database background and then an application background, thinking about how we process data while it's in flight is really quite a change, a 180-degree change. Instead of picking data from a data store and doing something to it, we are doing something to a single event as it flows through a streaming pipeline. And as a single event, we may not have much context as to where this fits into the entire data set for a day. We may not know what's coming before. We certainly don't know what's coming next. And you know, how that data is structured, etc., is quite different to dealing with a database-based system. However, it does offer some very interesting opportunities when we think about using artificial intelligence and, well, let's call that machine learning, and predictive technology. And it's because it allows you to build predictive models or machine learning models that are streaming models rather than batch models. Although this is still a relatively new area for a lot of organizations, you know, there are a lot of skills out there. A lot of people have been doing Coursera courses. University grads are quite skilled in this area. The big cloud providers provides super, really high quality training for machine learning platforms. And what we're observing is now there's an emerging trend to build streaming machine learning models and streaming predictive models so that every attribute of data that flows in changes the model. So you may be streaming all of your credit card transactions into a model that could be used to, say, detect a possible fraud for those, and every single transaction will change that model. So rather than feeding into something like Spark and doing an end of day view of all of the activity for that day, your model is changing continuously. There's some interesting material from Google on TensorFlow for connecting it up to Apache Kafka and having a streaming machine learning model. And as I said, as I recommended earlier, feeding a graph engine for this type of thing is becoming more and more important. Just modeling the very complex relationships between data across your platform, so from database to big data to streaming. And within the streaming world, when you offer a centralized platform, you would probably quite rapidly get to hundreds of different topics of data. Topics are like tables, and managing the relationships between these sometimes requires a graph engine. Common use cases for this are next best offer. I think this is an area that certainly my customers up in Thailand have got quite sophisticated pipelines going out to software as a service marketing providers in order to generate next best offers. And it's really a question of sending them good quality data where they can feed it into their marketing engine and decide whether or not to send an offer out to that particular customer. It's largely about filtering to ensure you don't sell low quality data, and joining disparate data sources together to create that holistic view that these sorts of marketing engines require. And my fifth and final choice is to build customer trust with data and automation. If a data in motion platform is indeed a separate pillar to join the various other data stores that you have in the bank, then we have more data to think about and more data to govern and to administer and to monitor and all of that. And I believe that data integrity is the next major business imperative from a data management perspective. So for you system architects out there and CIOs and CTOs, thinking about the quality of data is, of course, always important. Harvard Business Review recently reported that 47% of newly created data records has at least one critical error. And you might say, well, fix it before it goes in, but of course you only find this out much later on. And it's fixing data that's already in your golden sources is not a trivial thing, and often that error has to remain in the data, and the engines have to adjust to account for anomalies in the source data. This is really what data quality tools are about, right? They adjust these types of anomalies. And Forbes recently reported that 84% of CEOs are concerned about the quality of data that they're basing their decisions on. And for those of us that work in the data space, it's really our goal to increase the trust in data as much as we possibly can, so that the business is able to make good decisions based on that data. I work with banks to integrate stream processing pipelines to data governance platforms. So the data quality concerns for streaming data are similar to data quality concerns for any of the other data store types. It should span databases, big data, and streaming data. For those of us that run, for those of you that run Kafka systems or that may be more familiar with Confluent, at our Kafka Summit last week, we had a great talk on some of the emerging technology for data governance and data quality for our cloud, our software as a service product, which now comes with some of these sort of features built in. What we observe in other banks is there are already centralized platforms for data quality, and it's really a question of integrating the data streaming platform into your current bank infrastructure, so that you're able to do change control, integrate with DevOps pipelines, be able to set up centralized role-based access control with your Active Directory, to set up access control to consume and view that data. All of these types of integration tasks. Sometimes our professional services spend quite a bit of time setting all of this up. And the final point on this, I think, is really as a sort of data stewards in your organizations, you should insist on the same high data integrity standard for all of your platform types. I think that as these various newer platform types emerged, there was some leniency for the standards, and this applies to the early days of data warehouses. It applied to the early days for big data systems, and it has applied for the early days of streaming systems as well. But I think those days are over. The technology is there. You can register and validate schemas. You can version control the schemas, and it's possible to basically apply the same high standard across all of the different types of systems that are processing data across the bank. And that concludes my 5 points. I don't know if you agree. We're very welcome to have a discussion on this in the final part of today's webinar. So that concludes my part. I'm going to stop sharing and hand back to Kevin. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for that presentation on 5 key technology trends, top 5 key data in motion trends in 2021 that are shaping the FSI industry. Big thanks to you, Mark. Lots of key points there. Really looking forward to taking that forward with you and with the rest of the panel in our panel discussion. Thank you, Greg, for sharing the slide up there again. All right. An overarching view of those 5 key trends that Mark has just presented is that the way that data is viewed by organizations has shifted over the past 1 to 2 decades. Data used to be viewed as sort of a byproduct of doing business, where you provide a service and as a result, you get data that's generated out of it. However, the view nowadays is that data is a core component of a business and is something that companies leveraging technology are keen to get the most benefit out of. This shift in how data is viewed is now driving technological advancements to optimize and scale technological capabilities with a view to offer more value to customers in the form of better services and better products, as well as to optimize application management processes. In this panel discussion, we're here today to discuss how these key trends are driving change in the FSI industry and to share some of our experiences, especially with some of the great panelists that we have here for you today. That brings us to our first question of the day. Many organizations are starting to view data analytics and ML as a core component of their business, as opposed to it being a secondary focus. what are some, so this question is for you, Niels. What are some recommendations for business leaders when developing or modernizing their data capabilities?
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks, Mark, for a great presentation. I think, data is no longer a secondary thing. Data is the thing to consider when you're building out your capabilities. And there's a few things to really focus on. One is, I think it's critical to establish the central function that look at the tokenization, the data management, the data governance, and also actually where you do have deep expertise on data in motion, real-time analytics and real-time capabilities around data. So you can start understanding what are some of the use cases that will add value to your organization. So that's point one. Point two is roughly 15 to 20% of value from analytics is lost in the front line. So you really have to put in a dedicated effort to ensure you simplify the way you're going to present and use that analytics and data so it actually turns into value for the business. I've seen now both in my existing life in Standard Chartered, but also in my previous life in McKinsey, that a lot of effort and a lot of money is being spent on advanced models, and ultimately nothing comes out of it because the frontline don't know how to use it. When the customer calls the contact center, when an RM speaks to a customer, etc. So I think that's extremely important to have that in mind. And the third thing is this can seem extremely complicated and big. So start small and start fast. Get going with something. Find the use case that makes sense. Don't overcomplicate it, and really try and get going on some of these elements. Something could be as simple as just creating analytical capabilities to enable your eyes with some simple dashboarding using some of the vast amount of data you already have. You can extract that into some cloud storage and then start building simple models on it. So those are some thoughts from my end on that.
Thanks, Niels. I'm just going to touch upon something you mentioned, where you mentioned that based on your experience, you've seen a lot of cases where a lot of money is being spent on advanced models, but because they're so advanced and because they're so complex, the front line sometimes doesn't know how to use it. Model explainability and bridging that gap between people and the science or the mathematical or the tech side of it is something that people talk about as a key thing to bridge that gap and take things forward. What's your thoughts on that? Do you think that's a critical thing as well?
Super critical. And actually, our previous CDO left to build a company around explainable AI. So it is it is certainly something that's very important. Here again, I think the way to get started is not to start from scratch. There's a lot of things out there like Data Robot and other capabilities that already have a preset defined of modules and analytical capabilities, and you can get started from the 10th floor instead of starting from the first floor. So leverage what's out there. Find some boutique vendors that can come in and really bring this knowledge and then get going. But I think dumbing it down is actually quite important because this can become extremely complex. And some of the things Mark talked about, right, is quite sophisticated and complex in order to make that work at scale. But you have to start somewhere. And I think success in a 3-month is more important than a 12-month program to try and get value. For me, it's all about creating value at the top line and ultimately at the bottom line. It's not about the fanciness of the technology and the tooling.
Thanks for that, Niels. So just for everyone's benefit, Mark, Niels, Mohan, so I've known Mohan for a while, but Mark, Niels met Mohan and myself for the first time yesterday. And one of the key things that Niels mentioned yesterday was technology is all great. I mean, it's great to have really super complex technology, but what's the value you get out of it? And I think that's something that we're hoping that our audience members, get out of this as well, where we're talking about key trends in the FSI space around technology and data, with an emphasis on what value it's going to add to you. Niels, just coming back to something you mentioned about when you said don't start from scratch. I believe you're referring to, like low code, no code tools. There's a ton of them out there in the market. Do you have any? Well, you don't have to mention any products by name, but is that something that you recommend to get started or even to move forward to get close to production?
Yeah, I think it's worth having a look at. And we are using something for models. We're using data robot for next best offers to buy. We're using certain products we are buying and able to add and enhance those models. So I think because we have realized that we are not going to be a high-end, sophisticated data science shop. Access to that talent is just a privilege. So we're going to have a few, hopefully, that are really at the top notch, but that can scale. We can't sit and wait for 5 people to come up with sophistication. We need to get this out to 10,000 people. So that's the way we're thinking about it. So I definitely think predefined capabilities and accelerators that some partners can bring, that's something you certainly should look into. But you have to assess if it's really the right fit for you. And for me, the key thing, don't lose the touch with the customer. Don't compromise on the experience. And don't compromise on the value you can create. But if you can accelerate, then for sure, yes, do that. And if it can help your organization to be more effective in the way that adapts to new technology or analytical capabilities, then yes, for sure.
Thank you, Niels. There were some really key critical insights there. And I think you touched upon it again. Don't compromise customers' trust. Don't compromise value. Leverage technology to take things forward. I think that sets us up for our next question. Let me read it out for you guys, for everyone in the call. What are some of the key drivers to modernize core banking systems to be cloud native and microservices driven? This is very much on trend and on point for the FSI industry. What mindset is required to set out on this transformation journey? And what are some of the challenges? Maybe I'll pose this question to Mark first, but we can take it around the panel.
Sure. Thank you, Kevin. I think the single biggest driver is the one you'd expect. It's tech refresh, right? Applications are constantly evolving, and every now and again you have to completely refresh an application with new technology. You're very rarely going to replace it with existing technology, and many of the systems that have been talking directly to core banking systems over the years, they're using whatever the platform choice, I guess, of the design time is. These days, we're observing quite a number of banks that are doing tech refresh to build microservice-based applications, replacing something that would have run much closer to the mainframe before. So it may have used more of a 3GL technology, and it might have been deployed quite some time ago. And now they want to build something like an event-driven microservice, very commonly rebuilt using Spring as the platform of choice to be able to create individual microservices that are very discrete, that perform single operations, where they can build development squads. The ability to hire skills is super important, right? If you're going to need 100 developers for a year to rewrite an application, you need to be able to find those skills in the market, and that's also a major driver on the technology choices for doing this. It would be possible to still use best of breed technologies for writing new applications. So not in a case where we're doing a tech refresh. There are plenty of cases where we have brand new use cases that haven't existed before. But then the difficulty becomes, how do they exchange data? How easy is it for a streaming application to retrieve data from, say, a core banking system that stores all of the loan data, for instance? It has a very different sort of set of interfaces, and this creates difficulties around volume, around access control, around even things like encoding and decoding, and the fact that mainframes use very different data formats to your typical microservice kind of platform. So this is why we do tend to see an emerging trend of streaming ETL. I would say roughly 50% of the systems that I work on are really not about building any particular new application. It's about streaming data from one system to another system in a timely way. And in many cases, even the team setting up the pipeline doesn't really know the full capability or the full extent of what that data will be used for. They're just setting up a capability from a core banking system through a streaming platform and making that available as a service in the bank. And it's really a case of sharing data rather than distributing data. This ability to make that data available, make it everywhere, one of our cloud native trends, is another big driver, I think, to the emergence of data in motion for banks.
Mark, just a quick one. I'm just going to touch on something you mentioned where I think you said 50% of the time you see people working on just building out that capability. Would it be fair to say that in those cases, they're on the start of that journey? They build out the capability and then they move on by adding features, adding services on top of it?
Yeah, there's a fairly significant trend that we see emerging in that the particular platform that we deal in is called Apache Kafka. It's available as an open source product, and it's just popular with data technologists. I mean, it's very common to see it downloaded, run it on a MacBook, and then next thing you know, it's running on a Linux VM, and next thing you know, it's running on a Linux cluster, and it's processing data. It's actually it's a very interesting platform to play around with. It's pretty consistently in the top 5 most popular open source products for the last 15 years. So technologists on data teams tend to enjoy playing around with Kafka in the same way that they've enjoyed playing around with Spark. A similar, very interesting architecture and setup and capabilities and things like that. So we do tend to see data technologists setting up Apache Kafka to solve some discrete problem, and it could be something, a very infrastructure-ish sort of problem, something to do with logs or metrics or just scraping data from servers or something like that. And a Kafka system is installed and it's up and running, and next thing you know, there are just other use cases that want to do it, and at some point there's a desire to start flowing customer data, business organizational data through that rather than just infrastructure data. And that's when we started moving towards thinking about a centralized capability, a shared service that anyone can use for logging or metrics data, but also for loans or credit card or deposit data, for controller and op data, for pretty much anything that any of the data is contained in the data store. So yeah, it tends to start as a hobby project, and then there's a desire to sort of grow that into a central platform of some sort.
Thanks, Mark. Mohan, is there something that you can touch based on in terms of the mindset, based on your experience as well?
Yes. So firstly, good morning, everyone. So when we're talking about mindset in the transformation, here we are talking about what your application should be having. So something like a high availability, delivering new features, like how Mark mentioned earlier about the tech refresh is a key factor in any transformation journey. So the mindset should always be looking for things in the futuristic perspective, something like DevOps driven development. So this is something not a cloud native concept, but it's deep down. We are talking about leveraging some of the modern DevOps practices, something like a continuous integration and a continuous deployment, and to ensure applications always is as expected, like build and run should be as expected. But when we talk about modernizing DevOps practices, it's more about shift left approach. You are bringing back the feedback loop much earlier in the phase in any transformation journey. And also the most important thing which I can think of is in any transformation journey is about identifying the gaps and seeing how we can scale up both in the infrastructure perspective and also adding up new features. But And also one more thing which I wanted to talk about is about the value. So which Neil has mentioned earlier in the previous question, it's about seeing the value. So you won't see the value instantly, but you will be seeing over the time. So the journey and the mindset should be always to be more agile, and the agile based thinking should be present over the time, and it is an incremental approach, but not a one stop journey, like, or a two stop journey.
Thanks, Mohan. Niels, go ahead, please.
Yeah, great points across the panel. I think just from my side, two things. One is when you embark on something like a heart surgery, which this really is, make it business driven, make it business backed. Don't take a one-for-one migration approach. I'm sure there's both customers, but very, very likely products that you are not really getting any value out of and that are not being used. So when you create a value tail, what are the actually 10 things that give the 90% of the value, focus on that, and then the 90 things that are often also even more complex that don't give value, just don't do them because 5 customers is using a specific product. That's one thing. The second thing is we embarked last year on modernization of our core environment, and we have now, to date this year, deployed an X number of markets, and we are, this is a cloud enabled, I would say, not a cloud native, but where you're using a lot of the cloud capabilities, you're getting away from legacy databases, middleware capabilities, you are bringing in streaming around your cloud, your core, and we are building that out and deploying that across all our markets in the years to come. What approach we took was actually look at the product into a segment and then focus on one first. And this is also due to the way our backends are structured. But so we focused a bit more on the CASA, overdraft, FX kind of capabilities versus and the lending and credit card we are doing at a later stage. We are likely going to take two different approaches. On the first set, we're going to do a modernization, where we take the existing capabilities and move that into a cloud-enabled universe. And on the second one, particularly around lending, we are considering to go one of the fourth generation core banking platforms and build out a flexible lending capability there, because we believe that in the future, the product flexibility needs, in particular that segment and an area of products is quite critical. So that the learning here really is modernize a bit how you think about it, and then sit down and think from a business back, what actually will create value? Is it the existing products I have, or is it a future set of products that I need to start thinking about enabling? I think future, when you think about partnerships going forward, most banks should be really working hard on that and ultimately becoming an infrastructure provider. And your core modernization needs to enable that as well. So how do you think about that aspect of it as well? So those are some of the things that we are thinking about and working through.
Thanks a lot, Niels. Given your role as a technology leader, I think that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for your insight on this question. I think that brings us, I think that's a pretty good segue into the next question. We've had, we've had some pretty good insight right from the role of a leader in the FSI space to a role from a product and a services perspective. I think that's a really good that's a really good summary of key drivers that drive modernization efforts, as well as mindset that's required when embarking on a transformation journey. Let's move on to the next question. Let me read the next question out for you. And this question is for, again, it is for all of the panel. A key differentiator today between competitors' offerings in any industry is how personalized the service is. And this is usually driven by data on consumer behavior. what privacy guidelines need to be at the front of your minds during this whole process? Maybe I'll put this question to Mark first.
Thanks, Kevin. At the risk of sort of restating some of the points from my top 5, data privacy is a big part of all of this, and it's not trivial. So I think the single central point is to have the same, apply the same standards across all of your different platforms, including your streaming platform, so that, from an audit perspective, from a sort of security investment, from monitoring and metrics and all that, you should have the same standards for the data streaming platform. Specifically on the data privacy guidelines, I think assuming everything is encrypted all the time anyway, that's a given these days. The tokenization layer does tend to arrive a little bit later. It's often driven by a desire to move to a cloud provider. As soon as your data starts moving from on-prem to cloud, you have to start thinking about the disk falling off a truck scenario. If my data was available in a way that I can't control, how safely do I sleep at night knowing that that our customer data is protected? And that's really where tokenization comes in. Taking this out of the realm of responsibility of the developer is important. Too many ultimately this is a service that's really needed across all applications. Any application that handles PAI data needs consideration for tokenization. In our view, for our particular product, our recommendation is to do it at the client. So like most systems, such even like a database like Oracle, a streaming system like Kafka, a data processing system such as Spark, they all come with a server and a client, and the application developers build their part of it using the client. The client is also open source, right? You can take the client, you can download it, you can modify it as you need to. So you can build your tokenization layer into the client, and you can issue a mandate in the bank saying, if you're going to connect to the system, you have to use the bank's client, because we have already modified the client to handle the tokenization required for the bank. All data is not equal, right? Depending on how many different classifications you have, you'll have data could be everything from publicly available, what's on your website, to internal only, to customer confidential, all the way up to sort of salaries and personnel kind of information. So each of these different data classifications requires different data privacy controls. And this is the functionality that you sort of build into your data governance layer, which should talk to your application clients, such as your Kafka client or your Spark client or your database clients, in order to interpret the data governance layer and turn it into the actual data that the application should have access to, whether that's data in its original form, or whether that's tokenized versions of that data, or even possibly a step further with a complete obfuscation and removal of that data from the data, depending on the sensitivity. Yeah, thanks, Kevin.
Thanks, Mark. Yes, I think you did touch upon those things during your some of those things you just mentioned during your presentation, but it's always good to get a refresher and to link it back to different things. I just want to ask you a quick question on the governance model. I think you mentioned about implementing a centralized governance model. You also talked about taking stuff out of the realm of the developer via using a central governance model. You also mentioned something about access control to keys when you're talking about encryption or decryption of data. Could you give us a bit of an idea of some of the key considerations based on your experience?
So the benefit of keys are used to encrypt data, right? So it's not possible to encrypt data unless you have some form of key, and the question becomes, who owns the key? So inside a bank, that's a pretty easy question to answer. It's issued by your InfoSec team. So you say, I want a key because I want to start some form of an encryption process, and it requires a key, so give me a key. It becomes a bit more complex on cloud providers and for software as a service provider, because they will, assuming that you need a key to do encryption anyway, where does that key come from? So there is an emerging desire now to have bring your own key for software as a service providers, so that you can say, all right, I want you to store my data, I want it encrypted everywhere, and here's the key. So you're able to provide the key to that service provider. They can encrypt it, but that service provider does not have the capability to decrypt it, because you're withholding some critical information from that service provider that they would need to decrypt that data. But that's fine, because all the service provider needs to do is to do the encryption. You're going to handle the decryption part at your application tier. So bring your own key is important. There are key stores in the bank. There are key stores on the cloud providers. The cloud hyperscalers, this is not an area I'm specialized in, but I think they have ways of merging this together so that you have a single sort of control over key management. But certainly for ourselves with Confluent Cloud, which is our offering, and for other peers in the industry that offer software as a service, we offer the ability to bring your own key. It is somewhat cloud hyperscaler specific, because they do offer this service in different ways. Yeah, that's certainly the way the industry is going, the desire to bring your own key for any providers that will store data on your behalf.
Yeah, maybe if I just may add, so from our end, since we are actually operating in a multi-cloud and have a very focused multi-cloud strategy, we are working with certain parties to create this key capability outside of all SaaS, of all IaaS, basically. So I think it's a capability you need to be thinking about like that. Yes, there's something on Azure, there's something on AWS, but then you also log into that. That's a little bit our view. But I think just back to around how do you scale this and enable an organization of, let's say, 1,000 or 10,000 in your tech? It's very important you think as a service. So DevOps has been around for a while, but DevSecOps, where I believe this comes in, right, is you have to think every single thing that has to be created and enabled should be a service that a developer can use and embed into the way they develop and build code. And this also comes to the way tokenization is done, encryption is done, the way integrations are done, etc. So you have to really enhance the central capability from being what I think previously was a bit more of a governance function and a tooling provider to now being a high-end engineering capability that actually builds out certain components and capabilities and provides services so the different development teams can do it. So this whole notion of internal open source and figuring out how you actually don't build things twice and reuse of capabilities, providing services is extremely important. And it's a journey we have embarked on, and we're still in a very early stage, but a lot of commitment wanting to create a better place for engineers to develop and bring basically code to production.
Thanks a lot for that, Niels. I'm going to pick up
where my voice has been a bit flaky. Is this better now? I think I have some internet problems at home. Is it better now, or are we still in a...
Yeah, you did have a bit of disturbance earlier. It's much better now, but there's quite a heavy echo at the moment. It could be because you're on your speaker on your laptop. Is that right?
Yeah.
Do you have a headset or earphones by any chance that might help with the echo?
No.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no worries. We'll figure it out. I mean, the message you bring is a lot more important, right? Cool. I'm gonna take one of the things you just talked about. We talked about insourcing development of tools so that you don't have to recreate the wheel every time. Create an easier environment for development. Mohan, given your experience as a DevOps practitioner and evangelist, what are some? what are your thoughts on this? I know you're doing something along the same line in your current role. Is that something that adds value? And maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yes. Pretty much most of the points are being covered by the fellow panelists, but I would like to echo on one of the points which which was mentioned. So it was completely about the governance model should be more of a centralized approach rather than having a decentralized approach, because a centralized approach governance is the key game changer sometimes in these organizations, especially when you're in a transformation. And also something which I also feel is about the encryption. It should be provided at a granular level. It can be used using some ACLs, or when you talk about ACLs, then obviously next comes is the RBACs, has to be around the object stores or in the databases, or in our instance, if you talk about the real-time event streaming, something like at Kafka topics. And basically you have to put the RBAC and the ACLs at the granular level as possible. And also at the data privacy should, as Mark has mentioned in his previous presentation, data should be always encrypted in flight. That's obviously through the TLS way of doing things. But from the consulting perspective, which we often hear is about protecting the PII data is the utmost priority for most of our clients, and they wanted to align with the regulators approach over here. They don't want to go in bad terms with the regulator, because everybody knows what's the consequences. So protecting the PII data and using the external data sets to enhance the analytics, and most importantly, the PDPA and GDPR must be protected via the anonymization techniques. And obviously, when we talk about tokenizing, we need to detokenize. And when we detokenize, and to what extent and what geographical location, all this should be in line with the regulators' approach as well.
Thanks, Mohan. Excuse me. Thank you for that. Thank you for linking, everything we talked about in terms of tokenization and anonymization. Thank you for linking those to PDPA, GDPR, because you're right. In fact, there are specifications in the PDPA which specifically deals with anonymization, which there's a whole document online that you can use to refer to when you as a bank or as a company are trying to implement something around anonymization. Before we move on to the next question, I just want to redirect that question back again to Mark, because I'm sorry, Mark, the question I'm referring to is the one about insourcing, where engineers don't have to redevelop the wheel. I'm gonna touch upon this with you because you talked about open source, how important that is, and tools like Kafka and Spark is something, both tools that developers and engineers have really taken a liking to, and they use for POCs or spikes, etc., etc. What experience do you have on that, in terms of how does that add value to your teams, in terms of morale or in terms of building out functionality over time?
I think there's always a desire to work on emerging technologies, and whatever is being chatted about on Hacker News and Stack Overflow, and the various technology forums, whatever's hot at the big data conferences, etc. It's always great to allow tech staff to have exposure to technologies that they're interested in as well, and that could be of benefit to the bank. It's interesting that most of the banks up in Thailand have a sort of a research division, where they have a team of people that explore the new technologies, and all they do is POCs, and they kind of figure out how to apply these technologies back to the bank. I think it's partially driven by the intense competition within their domestic market. And if one bank sets up a research house, then and the other banks don't, then the staff will kind of move to wherever the most interesting roles are. So I think another area that has changed this significantly is the quality of training available from the cloud hyperscalers. So all three offer very strong capabilities in the data space, and they offer very good quality training available, and you can get it via platforms such as Coursera, etc. So I think allowing some bandwidth for developers to self-learn, if that's something that they want to do, and to explore these technologies is great. Hopefully meetups will be back soon, where people can start getting together again, sort of informally, to talk about what's interesting, what's emerging, what their employer is working on. Meetups are an important part of this whole ecosystem, and it's all gone a bit online lately, but we're hoping maybe early next year we'll start seeing more in-person meetups again, because it's an important part of the open source community, particularly here in Singapore, I think.
Thank you for that, Mark. I think in this, go on, Niels.
Yeah, I managed to find a headset. I don't know if it works.
Super now, super, yeah. Thank you.
I just want to touch upon what Mark and Mohan said at the end. I think actually when you think about enablers to really get moving on this, I think that whole organizational aspect is quite important. So one thing is to allow this experimentation and POC. I think that's critical, and that we are really trying to reduce our governance on this significantly. So if I want to do a POC as a developer, it's a few approvals and then off you go, as long as there's no production data, there's no PII and other things, right? So that we are really trying to do and build out the infrastructure, services, and capabilities that can enable that. That's point one. Point two is you need to rethink the way you think about your technology organization. We are focusing a lot on what we call engineering excellence, which is we are completely pivoting the career path for our colleagues, so they become much more technical oriented instead of in the traditional way going from a developer and then ultimately you are on a CIO path. That doesn't attract the right people anymore, and you lose a lot of good talent along the way. So focusing on skill building, enabling training, actually almost mandating that if the more advanced you get, the more we want to see you being active in external communities, active in open source communities, be taking certifications, even be on panels or other things that helps educate others, contribute to the open source with codes, or be a part of the review communities. All this stuff is critical in order to develop yourself as a developer. And we are really trying to push, but it's quite difficult to push people to take the time to educate themselves and experiment with this. And we are experimenting with a different ways of doing it, like small programs like Learning is my day job. Take 2 days off. We're having now one in the end of September. So 2 days only dedicated for learning, and don't think about delivery, don't think about anything else, and just learn. We are scaling up any cloud certification, awareness learning programs, also with other platform providers like Confluent, etc. So it's I think it's a journey, but it's very important to instill that mindset that we have to move away from it being technology being a back office and you outsource your talent to you have high-end talent internally, and you have an elastic model with vendors and partners, and you help your internal teams to become really high-end engineers over time. The efficiency rate is 1 to 10, from a bad engineer to a good engineer. So you, instead of having 10 squads, you can have 1 squad with high-end people, which is maybe a little bit optimistic, but that should be the philosophy.
Thanks for that, Niels, Mark, and Mohan. I think this question we covered a broad range of things. I mean, we started talking about governance. We started talking about governance and how that sets a foundation for building further services. And then, we talked a little bit about some experiences around the topic of encryption. And I think we ended up with talking about how fostering a culture of innovation, allowing people to learn, express creativity, work on POCs, how that benefits the organization over time. That was a pretty broad-ranging response. Thank you so much for that to all our panelists. Let's move on to the next question. We've talked a little bit, I'm just going to read the next question. We've talked about how this view of data as a core component of a business is driving enhancements to services and service personalization. Underpinning all of these strategic aims is the actual technology. So let's talk a little bit about this as well. How does a real-time data streaming platform empower an organization to achieve goals around modernizing applications and analytics? Maybe this one I pose to you first, Mark.
Thank you. If I was to boil that question down, like to its core, like the core principle is really, what's the benefit of streaming data? What can we, what's going to be better when we have this capability in place? Look back at the origins of where a lot of banks started with streaming data was OTPs, right? You want to do something for your internet banking and you send out an OTP to a customer, they get it on an SMS, they type it in, and off they go. They're authorized to do something, and that was an early perfect example of streaming, right? You can't do this type of operation with batch. You can't even really do it with a database because you have to think about response times, during peak periods and end of month and payday and all that sort of stuff. And it was an early example. And a lot of banks sort of started, their first streaming platform was something to handle OTPs. And I think that this has evolved now into payments, right? Our expectation of our as customers of banks now is when we do payments, they're pretty much instant, and there are a few different payment technologies available, but they're all moving towards the ability to confirm to you instantly that your payment is complete. And that's it could be across currencies, it could be across different banks, it could be international payments, things like that. And I think a lot of banks have taken what they've learned from simple and trivial use cases like OTP and then applied it up to something as critical to the bank as handling a payment. And it's a good example of taking a technology capability, then applying it back to the business and say, where else can we do this? Pretty much every bank that I'm working with at the moment, they're all working on some sort of a real-time payments project. And a payment is not simply one transaction where money transfers from one to another. It's an entire process flow where every point along that process flow is controlled and measured and audited. So this whole process chain becomes a stream processing pipeline. So I think that's an example of looking at a technology and saying, how do we use this? It'll be interesting to see where this goes in future. The emerging areas of predictive and machine learning over streaming data, I personally find very exciting. There's a whole lot that can come out of this, all types of systems, and it's great to be able to pull in more of the sort of technology trends that the cloud providers are working on and sort of pull them in on-prem, right? And be able to use some of that really interesting ideas. I remember seeing some talks from one or two US banks, the big US banks. Actually, they're on the Kafka Summit website. Banks like Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, that are fairly early adopters in this area, and they were talking about some of the fraud detection techniques that they've used. They've spoken about this publicly. Some of the you can find these presentations talking about some of the fraud detection techniques that they've used on their streaming data, and it's really interesting. They just apply more and more complex fraud detection scenarios over their streaming data in order to sort of reduce the cycle to detect something as possible fraud. And reducing that cycle is saving money for the bank. These systems pay for themselves very quickly. So yeah, it's look at a technology, look at the capability, and think, where can I use this in my business? I think that tends to be the best way to achieve a goal with this type of technology.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I think you did touch upon it a little bit during your presentation as well. Fraud detection techniques. That's a pretty big, pretty useful use case of event streaming, event streams, and those platforms as well. Maybe I put this question to you, Niels. So when organizations, when they want to expand their analytics, when organizations such as SEB want to expand their analytics and ML capabilities, they sometimes build data partnerships, with external data providers. It could be a full-time data provider, or could be another company in the same space or a complementary space. So when you're talking about sharing data sets for when you're talking about sharing data sets to enhance your analytics, privacy becomes a big thing, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Do you have any insight there, or any potential like challenges or benefits that can arise from such a use case?
Yeah, I think generally, so the way we think about this is ultimately open banking is gonna be the norm, and you have to be working hard on providing and enabling data capabilities externally. In particular, as you want to be more relevant in the ecosystem and create partnerships with the likes of e-commerce, retailers, telcos, utility companies, etc. And I think also when you think about customer acquisition, it's the volume and the scale you want to acquire at is likely more efficient through partnerships than it is by a direct to consumer or direct to corporate kind of model. So that's certainly something that's of a key priority for us, and we are building out those. When it comes to the actual sort of personalization of what you do, I think today the main model is trying to personalize, use data to personalize offers, but it's still a little bit, the day after or within the week kind of thing an offer is pushed. We need to move to a model where it's in the moment. So when you walk into a mall, that's when you get an offer that says, hey, if you use my credit card and you go to Harvey Norman to buy this bet, because I know that you have been engaged and have interested in or you've been moved or whatever it is, something that I have deep insights to, then I will be able to give you a 20% cashback or something like this. Or if you pay an online tuition fee for your kids, the offer should be around can we help you create a saving account or saving structure or sort of wealth management product or something that enables the long-term tuition payments that you need to think about for your kids. So we have to move from this a bit more what I would call rule-based offers and personalization that's happening within at best a day, and more likely it's on a schedule of a week or a monthly. And to be honest, it's a lot of useless crap you're getting, and myself included, also from my own bank. So there's a long way to go on this, but we need to move to this instant contextualized offering and use personalization for that. It also means your app should act differently, right? Depending on what you do. What you're being shown at the front of your app might be different compared to the time of the week, compared to what you're doing, how you are holding and operating your app, etc. So we will see a move towards a increased sort of a shorter time span when it comes to personalization and contextualization. We'll also see a more to application personalization capability. And that's going to be an exciting journey to follow along. I don't think anyone has gotten it right yet. But data streaming and real-time capabilities are the things that can enable this.
Thanks for that, Niels. That was that was really insightful when you touched upon data partnerships. And I think the thing you mentioned about the latency of personalization, like personalization does exist, and I think you're completely right. What's going to be changing in the future is the latency. It's going to be much quicker. It might even reach you while you are still in that shopping mall, like you mentioned.
Yeah, and don't push a credit card offer to someone who already has 2 credit cards. It's completely useless.
True. Good point there. I know I could benefit from that. Mohan, I'm gonna slingshot off that, and I'm gonna put this question to you. I think Mark touched upon this a little bit during his presentation when he was talking about application refreshes as one of the key drivers for using an event-driven system. So based on that, I'm going to pose this question to you. What value can a modern application architecture that uses event streaming, what value can this bring to a business in terms of like operations? By operations, I mean like, DevOps, stuff like that. And also in terms of development, providing new features.
Yes. So before coming to the value, I would like to actually, I was just thinking about this, and suddenly I got this an example of one of the client which we were dealing in the past, was actually to try to leverage the real-time data streaming and see how the results were actually helping them. So what our client was actually doing, it wanted to track the user journey right from the login to the logout. It wanted to understand what the user is trying to do, and to make sure that the transformation from one page to another page is more seamless. So when they wanted, either through a web application or a mobile application, they wanted to understand where the change in the design should be made over the due course of the time. So to get the real-time insight, they obviously chose the real-time event streaming platform, Kafka in this case, and they were building dashboards and monitoring the events, and then try to see where exactly the user is trying to do. Over the time, based on the insights, the client can one of our client actually made sure that it has identified some of the pain points in the design and revamped the design and done and have updated the system. So when they try to see whether the new changes is actually working or not, apparently most of the things which they were seeing in the previous data points were actually not being seen in the newer user journey. So this is an example of how your real-time event data through an real-time event streaming can help the organization. It can be as simple as the design. It can be as simple as doing a transaction. The seamless approach and the simple approach is what that needs to be done. And how is this can be done is, again, as you mentioned, through modern DevOps applications. Like, deployment should be seamless. The change should be implemented in the production environment sooner, because the change should be witnessed by the end user. That this obviously is done through a data streaming applications, where the data stores can replay the message and try to analyze the data in a much better way. And obviously, the last thing is measure the changes either through a unit testing or open it to the smaller environments, a smaller user group, and understand how they're doing things.
Thanks for that, Mohan. That was a pretty, I think we had a pretty good discussion on this question, where we're looking at, we talked about a number of things. We talked about data partnerships. We talked about how personalization is moving from something that gets refreshed as a feature. It's something that can respond more closely to being as real time as possible. Yeah, I think we covered a few things in this while we were discussing this question. Mark also touched upon, yeah, I like the way you phrased the answer, Mark. What's going to be better with streaming data? Things like fraud detection, things like simple use cases, which was OTP, has now led us to online payments. And banking is such a competitive space. Everyone's competing for market share. Having an online banking presence, with good experience, with close to 100%, like maybe I shouldn't use the word accuracy, but completion rate maybe for like an online payment. Those kind of things should go through. Whereas maybe 10 to 20 years ago, like, these things didn't really exist, right? You would have to go down to your remittance agency, etc., to get that done. Okay, cool. Thank you for that. Let's move on to our final question. This is our closing question for the panel discussion. This is going to be a kind of an open, slightly open-ended, but given the people that we have, given our panelists, it will be very, very useful to see what kind of insights they come up with. So the question is, any final comments or thoughts on how an organization can strive forward with data and tools when embarking on these transformation journeys? Anyone want to volunteer to go first on this one?
Okay, let me jump in. A few things, I guess. Don't be afraid of open source. It's not less secure, it is more secure. Having all of the code out in the public domain means that there are thousands of eyes scrutinizing this every day. And I've still come across some hesitancy towards using open source platforms. And there's a bit of a mindset change needed there. I think nominate some people to look after the streaming part of your business. If there isn't already a sort of a head of streaming and a team that have knowledge on this, then promote some people and say, do you want to be part of this whole new sort of emerging set of technology? I think that's an interesting emerging area. I echo some of Neil's comments about setting aside dedicated time for training and letting people get spend time in areas that they're very interested in. This is good for just good for job motivation and things like that. And just a final point on sometimes there's a perception that streaming systems lose data. They don't. Streaming systems offer delivery guarantees. Just as a commit on a database guarantees that your data is safe, a delivery guarantee for a streaming system guarantees that your message has your data pipeline is guaranteeing delivery. There's sometimes a perception that once you move away from a data store to some sort of a streaming platform, you should have an expectation of data loss. That's absolutely not the case. There's no data loss. You set your pipeline up so that your data delivery is guaranteed, irrespective of the failure scenario, all the way up to your whole data center going down. You're not going to lose any data. If this might have been the way that you thought about streaming systems and it's for less critical use cases, remember that almost all the banks here are now running payment systems on Kafka, and it really there's enormous capability to move other types of pipelines onto streaming systems as well.
Thanks for that, Mark. Any insights, Niels? Or any last comments you'd like to share as part of the panel discussion?
Thanks. I think a few things. One is think about how you enhance and build out your capabilities in the governing functions to enable this. So this is security, this is your risk, this is your tech governance, and those sort of whatever way you're structured around this is quite important. You either help your colleagues that are there already to understand what this means and what is the new norm, or you aggressively recruit in some top-end engineers that are passionate about those topics and bring them into those functions. We do both on that area. The second is if you have not started at all, then start small, start fast on something that you can without you can learn and fail without causing too much damage. But then I would quite fast move to an area that has a fair amount of complexity and high value. And then I would get some business leaders excited about this and get them on board to sponsor it. Only then it's going to make a difference. If it's become a technology exercise down in the basement with some Coca-Cola and pizza, it's not going to turn into what you want. And the final thing I find very interesting around all this is, we went through a number of different stages in architecture, from heavy monoliths to service-oriented to microservice enabled and decomposed architectures, to now more event streaming and event driven architectures. Actually, I think it's quite interesting to try and sit down and say, hey, if I were to build out from scratch completely, what would this look like? And what are some of the really aspirational things I could do around enabling event and data in motion and event streaming? And you won't get there, of course, if you start with your brownfield, but it will teach you a lot around how you should think about it. So I think be pragmatical, have an eye at value, make sure your supporting functions are enabled, and get business leadership is critical.
Thank you for that, Niels. Lastly, Mohan, anything you would like to share in terms of? Yeah.
So I would say that data mindset is the key in any journey, in any transformation, because if you're starting new, your mindset should be more in terms of experimenting. Most importantly, try more. When you try more, you fail more. At the end of the day, that's how you learn it. So, and in this process, you have to basically train people and educate everybody involved in this process, and that's how everybody is in line with the transformation journey. And most importantly, mostly what we see in consulting area and service, most of our clients actually do a POC. They'll be very excited for doing a POC, but mostly things doesn't go after the POC. My advice is don't stop with the POC, but do it on a continuous approach, because there's no definition of done for any transformation. You always strive for perfection. Your yesterday's results will be better than today's, I mean, the day before's, and today's will be better than your yesterday's. So try to do it on a continuous approach. Don't stop it after some time. The journey never ends in any transformation.
All right, thank you, Mohan. And thank you once again to Niels and Mark. That brings us to the end of our panel discussion, and that brings us up to our Q&A. I think Greg will be sharing the screen with the list of questions on Mentimeter. Thank you, Greg. What kind of low-code platforms are banks in general interested in terms of data? And I guess this would cover everything from visualizations, BI tools, connectors, except even databases, etc., etc. And of course, AI ML tools. I'll leave it open to the panelists. Anyone want to jump in and share a little bit of experiences there?
I can offer a little bit. For the data streaming part, we're really talking about stream processing. So we do have a low-code language, KSQLDB, and it essentially just uses select statements to do stream processing. So anyone that's ever written a select statement can write a stream processing application using KSQLDB. There's a happy coincidence that the database operations happen to be very similar to stream processing operations. You want to filter, you want to aggregate, you want to join, you want to transform, and a select statement pretty much expresses everything that most of the things that you want to do for stream processing as well. So that's on the stream processing side. I would recommend taking a look at KSQLDB. It is an open source, community platform. So you do not have to be a Confluent customer to use that. You can just download it and plug it into your systems and start using it.
Thanks for that, Mark. Maybe I'll jump in. In terms of visualization, the ELK stack is open source. There is an enterprise solution as well, but that has connectors with that has connectors out of the box that you can link up to a visualization tool. If you're talking about other visualization tools on some of the the big cloud providers, there are visualization tools that are free, and you even have data warehouse on some of those cloud providers, which are SaaS, where you don't have to manage any infrastructure, and you pay per usage. So yeah, that's also a very useful tool that you could use. I'm specifically referring to BigQuery as the data warehouse that's SaaS and where you pay per usage and you don't manage any infrastructure, and which has a native connection to Data Studio, which is out of the box. Mark, you touched upon some of the you touched on KSQLDB, which is super useful for for building streaming capabilities. There's a lot of connectors that are provided both by open source and by Confluent for directly linking event streams to things like data lakes, databases, etc., etc. Those are also really useful. Niels, in terms of POCs that some of your teams do at Standard Chartered, are there any different types of low-code tools that you have found useful?
Yeah, I'll go back to the data robot example. I think that one has accelerated quite a lot our capabilities to actually use fairly sophisticated models out of the box, and you can then enhance and train them So that is a great example of where you don't start from scratch, but you pick something up and get going at it.
Sounds good, Niels. Let's move on to the next question. When it comes to data governance, what kind of instances or ceremonies would you put in place to involve every employee? I'll open this question to the panel as well.
I think one area, and this might be a little bit controversial, but if you, let's say, assume you're moving more towards an agile ways of working, which most organizations are, you'll start defining OKRs. Those OKRs should ultimately link to performance management, and there should be one common performance capability and performance set of OKRs across tech, ops, and business, in my view. So actually, the controversial one here is actually you do have a clear definition of the ownership of data, of the leniency of data, of the usage of data defined. So anyone that is working within a given domain, it could be a core systems, it could be payments, it could be any sort of other capabilities you have in your architecture, that they actually are incentivized to bring this forward. That's point one. Point two is that you have this central organization that is like a COE that helps set what does good look like. So you have that on the data ops side, you have it on the SIE side, you have it on the DevSecOps side. Likely, if you are advanced on the API side, you can have that. We are not there yet, so we have it more as a central build capability as well. But that's the way I would think about it, really. And I think when this data is so complex that, and the governance aspect of it and management of it is so complex that don't allude to a manual process of getting it right. There's tools out there that can help you. But so I can't remember the specific names of these as we sit, but I do know we are trying to figure out what are actually AI tools and capabilities we can use to build out a robust data governance and management capability. Because if you sat down and ask people to do it, they'll start now and then maybe be done by 2030. So we need to think always acceleration, and it's better to get 90% right than not get anywhere.
Thanks for that, Niels. Maybe I'll jump in here a little bit myself, unless Mark or Mohan, you want to go first.
Just one thought looking at that question. We talked a lot about sort of pre-approval data governance. All the traditional stuff is still there. You should be auditing access on your system in the same way that you audit everything else. So who's logging in, who's requesting access to particular topics, how many messages have been sent out to particular users. You send all of this out to your audit stores in the same way that you've done for all other platforms. As Niels implied, you have a new toolkit available for interpreting that data, but the traditional way of just pushing everything into the bank-wide audit store to see who's accessing data across your organization, that still applies in the same way for these types of systems as it always has for other data stores.
Yep, totally agree, Mark. So basically, role-based access controls, ACLs in some cases, those are still in play no matter the kind of next-gen best of breed or even your traditional relational databases. It's the same concepts applied. I would like to go a little bit into ceremonies, but I don't think we have time for that. Let's quickly move on to the next question. All these questions are equally related at this point, but maybe let's take this one. How do you think data managed by AI can help? Oh, okay, when it comes to customer experience. Yeah, I think I'll open this to the panel. Mohan, I think you touched upon a little bit as well just a while ago when you talked about a client using analytics to do A/B testing to make changes to UX design. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yes. So, okay. So data managed by AI is for that, we actually need to build robust models firstly, in order to cater the customer experience. And initially, what I feel is that before even jumping into the artificial intelligence, we need to understand what kind of data will be helping the customer experience. Need to deep dig into the logs, metrics, and analyze things and build models on top of it. And by using that models, so coming up the fresh data, the good quality data can be injected into the AI, and then it can give us better results in the customer experience. Often again done using A/B testing and etc. etc.
Thanks, Mohan. So I think A/B testing is a little more on the analytics side. On the AI side, I guess it would come down to linking usage data. If you're talking about products, different types of products, what's the usage rate depending on different demographic data. We can even look at transaction completion rates based on demographic, based on time of day, based on product type. There's a whole bunch of, it depends on your use case, but depending on the use case, there's going to be different parameters that are going to be relevant to a model that you build when you want to enhance customer experience.
Yeah, even I would say right now your mobile app is fairly static. Why shouldn't that be customized to me based on my behaviors? And I think we will get there at some point. It's not right there yet, but that should be our end goal. And then the users should have the opportunity to decide how much customization that they want based on their behaviors, in a way. So I think there's nothing more annoying than having to follow 5 steps to get to the point that you really want to do. I think at some point it's going to be, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to see much more application to application usage of this. And this is one area where it's going to have a high degree of focus on the customer experience side.
Thank you for that, Niels. I think that's all the time that we have for Q&A at this point. I would like to say thank you to our panelists for your time and your energy. I think we had a really good presentation on top 5 trends of data in motion with a focus on the FSI industry. That was followed up by a pretty in-depth panel discussion. And the Q&A session, some pretty good questions here, talking about low-code, no-code tools, governance. That's very much in trend with what both the presentation and the panel discussion are about. But I think we've reached the end of our call today. I would like once again to say thank you to all our attendees. Thank you for making the time to join us today. We hope that you got something out of this, and we hope to see you all soon, hopefully in person, maybe for the next one.